This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. On this Thursday program, we have, starting off, K-State veterinarian Gregg Hanzlicek. He discusses Theileria, an emerging bovine blood-borne disease transmitted through a new-to-our-region species of ticks. Also ahead, two K-State county agents, James Coover and Justin Goodno, provide this week's 2022 wheat harvest update and insight into what they have seen in their own counties so far this harvest season. To round out today's Thursday programming, we have our second horticulture piece from the week from K-State horticulturalist Word Upham. He covers raccoons in sweet corn and how to prevent them from wiping out an entire crop in the home garden this season. That and more awaits us ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. To start off this Thursday's programming, we have with us Dr. Gregg Hanzlicek. He is a veterinarian here at K-State who is kind enough to join us fairly frequently here on the show. Frequently enough to be considered a series regular for sure. We're going to be covering an interesting new topic, and it's a new emerging bovine blood-borne disease. Is that right, Dr. Hanzlicek?
It is, at least for this area, and it's called Theileria, and we're going to call it an emerging disease. The organism that we're talking about today has really been around the United States for a very long time. It's a different species of the organism, and it doesn't cause issues in cattle. The one we're going to talk about today is specific. It's called Theileria orientalis, and then it's got a subgenotype called Ikeda, and that is the one that actually causes disease in cattle. So it's very specific organism and name.
Calling it emerging because, like you said, it's new to our area because it's carried by the specific species of tick that isn't commonly found in this part of the U.S.
Yep, so it's a long-horned Asian tick is what it's called. Some people call it the bush tick. It hasn't been found in Kansas. It's been found in 17 different states now. The closest one 2 times in Missouri and once in Arkansas. So it's probably coming this way. But it is the only insect vector that we know that will carry this organism. The brown dog tick is the one that carries anaplasmosis, which is a disease that everybody in Kansas knows we're concerned about. That tick doesn't carry Theileria, and the longhorn tick doesn't carry anaplasmosis. So they're very specific about what disease they carry.
Mm-hmm. A reason to be knowledgeable about this coming potentially our way, too, just because of the effects it can have on our cattle, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But like you said, this is a unique disease to this species of tick. This tick doesn't really carry other tick-borne illnesses that we commonly think of.
No, it's been proven that at least for Lyme disease, which is another really important human disease, it's been shown that it cannot carry that disease. So, yeah, it's very specific for this Theileria orientalis disease.
This disease, we've mentioned it's carried by this tick, but there's also some other ways that it can be transmitted as well. What are some of those?
Well, it's very similar to anaplasmosis because they're both red blood cell parasites. It's never been proven, but it's thought that probably biting flies and maybe sucking lice, which is not true for anaplasm, maybe in this case. And then needles. I mean, anything that carries blood from a positive animal to a negative animal could theoretically transmit this disease, but right now we're saying for sure the tick. Maybe there's other methods.
Sure. So as this emerging disease potentially enters Kansas, the needles thing is something specifically for producers to probably be mindful of.
Well, and the needle thing, we keep talking about it because it is important for anaplasmosis. It's important for bovine leukosis virus, and now it's probably important for this Theileria. So, yeah, it's a good reason to either disinfect or change needles between animals.
Sure, a good management practice to be practicing just in general anyways. And there are several types of this kind of parasite. I think blood-borne parasite is kind of what you just referred to it as. But there's only some that are pathogenic that you've mentioned.
Yep, and that's the one. That's Theileria orientalis Ikeda, and maybe Chitos is another one that might be, but there's a whole bunch of Theileria out there. Mm-hmm. And we can find them everywhere, but they do not cause disease. It's very specific for orientalis.
These blood-borne diseases, what are some of the effects that it actually has on the animal?
It's just exactly like anaplasmosis. It causes an anemia, so we've got weak animals. We've got animals with pale mucous membranes. When they start to recover, their mucous membranes may turn yellow, and those kind of things are what we typically see. The difference between Theileria and anaplasmosis is that we see clinical disease in calves with Theileria, which we rarely do in animals under 2 years of age for anaplasmosis. So that's one of the most concerning things about this emerging disease.
Right. I believe I read it was higher rates of mortality and morbidity for calves for this disease as well.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very high morbidity and mortality both for Theileria. In young calves, we're talking as young as 4 months of age, and it's a blood-borne disease. But like I said, that is completely different from anaplasmosis.
And as far as if these calves get infected at a young age, it's something that they carry with them for the rest of their lives if they do have it, right?
Yep, we consider them to be lifelong carriers for Theileria. And this disease is really prevalent in Australia, New Zealand. Japan has a heck of a time with it. And so looking at what they see in their cases is, these animals may be carriers, but at certain times of the year, anything that immunosuppresses them or stress can actually bring on the clinical signs again. So, and that's a little bit like anaplasmosis, but again, this affects calves unlike anaplasmosis.
You mentioned a few of the clinical signs, but we see this play out even vastly more so in terms of, gain, potential for abortions, things like that.
Well, it's definitely associated with abortion. I don't think anybody's really looked at the gains or anything economically on either beef side, even Australia and New Zealand.
Okay.
Because they have a hard time with it, but it's relatively new down there also. So we're learning a lot, trying to learn a lot about this disease.
Absolutely. Well, we're talking about, some major concerns associated with it, some of those clinical signs, things like that. The other major concern here is that it can't be treated very well.
Yeah, that's the other difference between anaplasmosis. Anaplasmosis, most of those strains are very susceptible to our tetracyclines. This organism is not. And so, at least in the United States, we don't have a really good treatment for Theileria. And so, again, that's when I said one of the concerns was it affects young calves clinically. The other concern is we really don't have a good way to treat it.
Yeah, and that's why we're being so kind of ahead of it here, hopefully, by putting word out, warning producers about it.
Correct, yep. And that's the thing, is just we're not trying to scare people. Like I said, we haven't found this tick in Kansas, but if it's in western Missouri, it's probably in eastern Kansas. And so it's going to be here sooner or later, and we just need to be on the lookout for it. And when we start seeing strange clinical signs in calves, we need to put Theileria at the top of the list.
And that's really what producers, I guess, should be looking for, because, the clinical signs are similar in adult animals that we see from other diseases, but it's really those calves that are the main sign that we should look for.
Absolutely. If they start seeing the pale mucous membranes, and especially the yellow color, there's only a couple diseases in calves, lepto and some other things that will cause that. And so if they start seeing those signs, weak calves, then, having a veterinarian come out, take the appropriate samples. We've got 2 blood tests that are very, very sensitive that will find the organism or the disease in the calves, and there's a good way to diagnose it, even in live animals.
Awesome. Good to know. And if they're looking to find resources, if they have a suspected case on their farm, what should they be doing? What samples should they be taking? Those blood samples, about how much?
Well, they can either take a purple top tube or a red top tube. Doesn't matter, but typically 8 cc's of either one of them is the appropriate sample.
And then going directly through their local veterinarian, or could they bring it to our veterinary diagnostic lab here?
Well, we do take producer samples. We strongly recommend that producers work with their veterinarian, because there are other things that can cause this disease. So instead of just pulling some blood and saying, is it Theileria, I'd talk to a veterinarian and say, are there other things we need to rule out? Because sometimes we can rule out multiple diseases on the same blood sample, depending on what blood sample you take. So we recommend working with your local veterinarian, but that we can certainly take the sample directly from you. But before you did that, I would call the Kansas State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab and talk to us about appropriate sampling and sample handling and those kind of things. Absolutely.
And if producers are tuning in and looking for more information regarding Theileria, where can they find that at?
Well, we just published an article in our newsletter that you can find on our website, ksvdl.org, that pretty well goes through what's been found and where it's going. If they have questions about ticks, whether if it's a longhorn tick, they can certainly take a picture of that, email it to us. We've got 2 basically livestock animal parasitologists on staff at the diagnostic lab. They'd be happy to look at those pictures. Don't send in the ticks. We don't want to be spreading disease. But just take a picture, send it to us, and they'll say, yeah, it's either a longhorn tick or it's not, and you can go on with life there.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Hanzlicek, we thank you so much for your insight on this subject, and hopefully it stays out of Kansas.
Yeah, hopefully it does, but I'll just about guarantee that in 5 years or whatever, it'll be here.
Well, at least we can say we covered it by that point.
Exactly. We were ahead of the game this time, right?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much again for your time. Once again, for more information, you can find Dr. Hanzlicek's article that he recently wrote about Theileria by searching for K-State Diagnostic Insights newsletter. The first link that comes up should bring you right to it, and you should be able to find it. It's titled Theileria, the Emerging Bovine Blood-borne Disease. We'll also have that linked in the show notes of today's episode, which can be found on agtoday.net as always. In today's show notes, you'll also find a few recent articles about ticks in general, just for public consumption, what to be wary of, things to know, and how to avoid them. So all good information coming from K-State's Research and Extension team, pertinent to know this time of year for sure. Once again, that and more will be linked in the show notes of today's episode, which can be found on agtoday.net. That was Gregg Hanzlicek, a veterinarian here at K-State, on Theileria, the emerging bovine blood-borne disease. We'll be back with more ahead here on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. You're tuned back in with us now for for the next several weeks at least, our weekly 2022 wheat harvest update, where we will have on various Kansas professionals providing us with updates as to how this year's harvest season is really going so far. For this week's 2022 wheat harvest update program, I brought on 2 different K-State county agents. The first being James Coover, who is a crop production agent for Crawford, Labette, Wilson, and Montgomery counties, and the second being Justin Goodno, who is a county agent for Barber County. Today, they're going to provide us with insight into how harvest went in their own areas, as well as some insight into some of the difficulties that they saw in their own counties as well. I have with us James Coover. He is a crop production agent who covers Crawford, Labette, Wilson, and Montgomery counties here in Kansas. And he's going to be joining us for this week's portion of the 2022 wheat harvest update for Agriculture Today. So, James, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So I know you're joining us from Independence, but like I mentioned before, you cover quite a few counties in the work that you do. What has harvest looked like in those counties so far, and has it really been completed in your areas?
It is getting pretty close to being completed, and so at this point, the wheat's completely dry now. In fact, it might be a little bit too dry, honestly, but the wheat's going fast, and so, I mean, they're getting almost done at this point. Really, at this point, they're really planting a lot of the double crop soybeans, even. And so as soon as that wheat came out, it probably wasn't a day or two, or maybe even that day, that they were going with the double crop soybeans. So we are getting wrapped up, and it's full steam ahead right now.
Wow, excellent. So, you've said you've pretty much wrapped up in these areas that you cover at this point. What has yield and quality data that you've gotten back from these areas looked like so far?
Yeah, so really it's not been that bad. I mean, I was kind of expecting a little bit better numbers than what I've been hearing, at least from the rest of the state. Usually when everybody else is dry, we get some of the better yield. So for the most part, I'm going to be talking about the soft wheat, because we grow a lot of soft wheat here in the southeast, a little bit different than the rest of the state. And so our soft wheat, our yields have been in the 60s and 70s, kind of the average that we've seen around the area. I heard of a max, all the way over 100 bushels to the acre for a field, and that's kind of common. And sometimes that soft wheat can push that 100 bushel mark. And so this year, it was no exception. It got pretty close to that. Some of the lows, I've heard some lows in the 30s and 40s in some of the fields, but you kind of expect that when you're hitting or missing, or you're planting a very late crop in. And so that's all the soft wheats. For the hard, there is a few fields of hard. We probably maybe less than 10-20% of our acreage is actually hard in the far southeast, and those yields probably be in the 40s. Most of them have been in the 50s, I would say. Our test weight percentages, they did pretty good, and so test weight, most of them have been over 60. I think the averages was around 62, and some of the test weights have been coming in real high. I mean, 64. One of the co-op guys, he said that his test weight was even higher than that. I mean, they got, like, one of their record test weight was 66 or something like that, or 67. So test weights have been pretty good. If it is a low test weight, below 60, it's usually got some sort of issue in it, and so some sort of vomitoxin, fusarium, it had an effect on the field. So.
Yeah, and since you brought up some of the issues, that vomitoxin being one of them, have there been any other specific issues that have arisen in terms of what you've heard from producers this season? Yeah, and so I was worried about vomitoxin, and so were all the other farmers. The vomitoxin, I mean, we were basically pretty rainy and wet during the flowering period. We were hoping that rain kind of came after the flowering, but some of it occurred right at the wrong point. And so we were seeing the little lining, the little pink lining on the spikelets, and starting to see that fungus in the wheat. So vomitoxin could have been an issue this year. But fortunately, for the most part, it doesn't seem to be showing up too much. Most of the co-ops, they're testing pretty much every load, or they're at least testing the first load at every field to kind of see what's in it. There have been, I've heard, about 10% of the loads coming in have vomitoxin in it, but nothing high enough to be rejected. And so the vomitoxin percentage probably around 2%, which is the average. If it's going to be docked, it's probably around 2%. For the highest that I've heard about so far is 3.9. So, which is still, I mean, that's another 1.1% below the rejection rate of 5. So nothing is quite getting to the rejection point of the vomitoxin. Just a few of them are going to get docked. You know, and that's another thing about growing soft wheat in this area. The dockage for soft wheat is much higher than it is for hard wheat. And so when they do end up getting that vomitoxin dock, it's kind of tough. I mean, because it's already hitting pretty hard in that taking off the price. So absolutely. Well, some good news in terms of it not being as prevalent of an issue as what was anticipated, for sure. Yeah. So, James, thank you so much for that update.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. And, you know, we're carrying along here. So
that was James Coover, a crop production agent for Crawford, Labette, Wilson, and Montgomery counties. Coming up, we'll have more for our 2022 wheat harvest for the week from Justin Goodno, who is a county agent for Barber County. So, Justin, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be with you.
So we're going to be covering the 2022 wheat harvest update for your counties. So let's start with, is harvest officially complete in the counties that you cover as of today?
Pretty much. If there's any left, it's going to be wrapped up within the next day or two.
As far as yield and quality goes, what really have you heard back from producers so far?
It's literally all over the board, and that's consistent from throughout the county. I mean, we've heard yields as low as 5 all the way up to 60, and so it really was pretty sporadic. You know, I can tell you there was some producers down, if we kind of look in the southern part of the county, like Hazleton, Kiowa, the Hartner area, we had some producers that did this year really well. I mean, it was 40 to 50. And then you get up in the northern part of the county, Medicine Lodge and Isabel, in that way. It was sporadic, but we did talk to some producers that considered it a pretty good year, ranging from 20 to 55. So it was kind of all over the board this year.
That seems to be the story with a lot of places this year, just because we've had some interesting weather that's come through, or lack thereof, I guess, in some cases. But yeah, a diverse reporting back in terms of yield for sure. But then as far as quality goes, has it been fairly good quality in terms of what, some of these, what little yield they did get?
Oh, yes. Quality is real good. That has been consistent throughout the county, whether it was talking to the grain cooperatives or just producers themselves, the wheat itself was really good. And, you know, the protein was real good. We've talked to people that's ranged from 13 all the way up to 18. So good wheat overall, just not much of it.
Sure. And as far as, you know, issues that may have been noticed as harvest was going on or even now post-harvest as we're getting this data back, were there any specific issues that producers, you know, saw or recognized this year?
Yeah, the common theme throughout the county was the stuff that was planted early took a pretty good hit. We went for a significant time without any moisture whatsoever, and the wheat that was planted later, when we got into October, and even some guys that planted early November, that wheat ended up pretty good. Also had some producers that got aggressive and banked on some rains coming and fertilized, and when they didn't come, burnt the crops up. But from throughout the county, the common theme was if you planted late, this was the year that it worked real well for you.
Have you guys had any concerns of vomitoxin? I know that some counties that was of utmost concern for them, and they're seeing, you know, less than they actually anticipated. Has that been a concern for Barber?
I have not heard that.
Okay.
If we have, it has not been shared with me.
Excellent. Well, like you said, I guess it was a good year to consider planting late. Were there any other things that led to a more productive crop than, you know, maybe others?
You know, I'd say first and foremost, it was the late planting. Second was the guys that really managed the nutrition of the crop, got along better. And I would say that's consistent every year. Those guys that really manage and pay attention consistently do better. You know, so it's a mixed bag depending on who you talk to. I mean, across the board, obviously yields were down a little bit, but we've got some guys that was pleasantly surprised with the crop, and we've got some guys that were pleasantly disappointed with it.
Sure. Well, Justin, thank you again for your time. I know this is a busy time of year for county agents for sure, so we just want to thank you for that update.
Hey, appreciate it, and welcome to KSRE. It's good to have you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Again, that was Justin Goodno, our Barber County Extension agent, on how harvest went this 2022 season for them. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Well, unfortunately, raccoons invading the garden are often the sign that homegrown sweet corn is ready for harvest. K-State horticulturist Word Upham says that raccoons love sweet corn, and the only effective control measure is fencing. Ward, I guess if you're seeing raccoons and you have sweet corn, that means the sweet corn is just about ready.
That means they're like an official inspector. They will move in and start taking that sweet corn about the day before you're ready to pick. And they really love sweet corn. And so if you have very many raccoons around, they can move in and just really wipe it out very quickly. So you need to control them.
So we might want to see them, but we don't want them attacking our corn.
That's right. And they're going to come in at night. And so you need to have something there to stop them from actually getting to that sweet corn. Now, there's several methods of doing that. One I haven't tested, but I've heard people give good reviews of, is just having a radio out in the sweet corn that is tuned to a talk station, not music. Music doesn't seem to work, but if you have a talk station, then leave that on all night and see if that works. I don't have enough feedback on that to know for sure that it works, but I've had some people that really swear by it.
Interesting approach.
Yes. Now, the other ways you can do this is by fencing. And there's a couple of ways of doing fencing. One is to use electric fence wire. And when you're using electric fence wire, what you want to use is the woven stuff that has the wire embedded in the woven material. That's a lot easier to thread around that sweet corn patch than it is the actual wire. And so use that, and then you're going to have to have a fencer. And normally what you're going to use is a battery-powered fencer just because you're normally not close enough to plug something in. And there are ones that are actually keep that battery up with solar power, and others you just use a regular, like a car battery, and it'll last about a month. And so you can do that in order to make sure that those raccoons don't get in, but make sure you have enough wires and they're spaced correctly.
You're trying to keep them from going underneath the fence as well?
Underneath and between and over. They'll find a way if there's a way. And so what you want are 2 wires. You can usually get by with 2 wires. The first one is about 5 inches above ground level. The second one is about 9 inches. So 4 inches between, and first one at 5, second one at 9. And usually that's going to be enough to keep them out. Now, the thing to watch on these is that they can be shorted out by weeds or anything else that contacts those wires. And so it's not going to hurt the fence at all, but you're going to have part of it that doesn't work. And so you need to continue to check that and make sure that you've got fire all the way through. Now, how do you check it?
I guess you don't ask your kids to do it, right?
No, they might do it once. And so that you can just touch it. I mean, it's not really going to hurt you, but it's not very pleasant. But they have testers you can buy that will tell you whether it's working or not. And so that's what most people do. And so that will tell you whether it's working or not. And then also there's another way to do the same thing, and that's to use kennel panels. And that, if you have a really small planting, that works fine. You just go around the patch with your kennel panels and just make sure there's no opening large enough for a raccoon to get in there. That usually works for several years. And then they figure out they can climb over and get into the patch. And then you have to cover the top. And so once that happens, I think it's almost easier to use the wire. And so those are 3 different methods you can try. The easiest is going to be the radio. And just see if that works. I'm just not absolutely sure that it will.
And is this something that we have to do for an extended period? Is this while the corn is growing as well, or just maybe when it's closer to harvest?
Yeah, closer to harvest. And so once you see those silks start to come out, that's probably a good idea to get everything set. Because once they get a taste of that sweet corn, it's really hard to stop them. So it's better to have it out early and working early than to wait until you actually start to see damage.
I'm assuming it depends on when they planted, but when might we expect harvest to be?
Yeah, it depends on how many days, but you're usually looking at July. And if you stagger your plantings, that can go further into July, maybe even into August.
That's K-State horticulturist Word Upham with information on using fencing to keep raccoons away from sweet corn. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.